in I will try to explain what is structural thinking in clinical phenomenology. But then I will also try to explain why I think that it is important in these times to be able to perform also a phenomenology of the fragment and not of the structure. So, to start from the beginning, we all know that in psychiatry and clinical psychology, we have an official nosography, an official categorization of so-called mental disorders. It is the DSM categorization, the ICD categorization. All right. Well, these have been great achievements in the history of our discipline, that's no doubt. The whole story started more than 1 century ago with the work of Emil Kraepelin, who is credited to be the beginner of contemporary nosography. Nosography means the classification of disorders, and specifically of mental disorders. Our contemporary nosography can be seen as a post-Kraepelinian or neo-Kraepelinian way to classify, to categorize mental disorders, okay? For good or bad, for good or bad. What we all know as practicing clinicians, so we are all clinicians working with patients, okay? Some of us, like myself, is also doing research, but what I assume is that many of us, psichiatria pratica, means that we are working with patients. And working with patients, we all know that contemporary nosography, contemporary classification of mental disorders is only partially covering the whole range of mental disorders. Okay, this is a very important point. In order to diagnose mental disorders in our time, we need to adjust real patients to very abstract categories. That's one point. We know this very well. We know this very well. There is an overdiagnosis of many conditions. Think of ADHD, for instance, or in Italy, we have an overdiagnosis of autism, for instance, or conditions like fibromyalgia, all right, or borderline personality disorder, or bipolar disorder. So, my impression, and I'm trying to empirically pin down this impression of mine by empirical research, my impression is that these diagnoses do not exactly reflect clinical reality. Okay? How are we trained to make a psychiatric diagnosis? Well, we are trained to identify symptoms as indexes of a given syndrome. All right? And syndromes are often classified in terms of category. All right? So the standard training of psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, but this also is the case for nurses and all mental health professionals, are trained to be able to identify symptoms in order to identify a syndrome, an aggregation of symptoms. Um, Another way to put it is that standard courses, postgraduate courses in psychiatry, uh, train residents to tick boxes. All right, it's ticking boxes. So there is quite a neglect for the reason why these symptoms go together. So um, it seems that contemporary clinicians are not interested in answering the following question. Why in this patient we have hallucinations, certain kind of delusions, kind of delusional perception, a certain kind of disorder in intersubjectivity. You may call it schizophrenic autism or any other thing, thought disorganization, etc. Apparently, our students are not trained to ask this question. Why do certain symptoms go together in a given patient? So this means that our students are not trained and maybe not interested. I'm not talking of you, of course, to reason in terms of structure. What is a structure? A structure is a whole, which means an aggregation of phenomena which go together according to a shared condition of possibility. To put it in Latin, a ratio essendi. So a reason why they go together. All right? Phenomenology, clinical phenomenology, is interested in the reason why certain symptoms go together. Clinical phenomenology is not interested in just making a nosographical diagnosis in terms of ticking boxes, but is interested in answering the question, why does this patient have this kind of delusion, this kind of hallucination, this kind of thought disorder, this kind of anomaly of intersubjectivity, etc. Because what we are interested in is to spot on the structural nexus between each of these phenomena. Clinical phenomenology calls this the life world. What is the life world? The life world is the world inhabited by a given person. So clinical phenomenology assumes that each person, including each patient, lives in a special kind of life world. So that the way this person or this patient experiences the world and himself or herself is the consequence of a certain change in his structures of subjectivity. All right? This is the basic interest of a clinical phenomenologist. What is this, the change in the structure of subjectivity of a given patient? All right? What is the core disorder in the structure of subjectivity, which means in the way of experiencing himself and the world, which is characteristic of that specific patient? And as a consequence of that, clinical phenomenology in the last century, since the 1920s, with the works of Ludwig Binswanger, Erwin Strauss, and Eugene Minkowski, who were the beginners of our tradition, okay? Since then, clinical phenomenology is interested in describing specific life worlds, characteristic of a given kind of being in the world, a given kind of form of existence. So we are not interested in listing the symptoms of schizophrenia. We are interested in describing the life world inhabited by people affected by schizophrenia. We are not interested in listing the symptoms of melancholia, but we are interested in grasping the overall structure of a melancholic world. And this is also the case with obsession, with hysteria, with so-called borderline personality disorder, anorexia nervosa, addictions, etc. So the core of clinical phenomenology, or let's put it this way, the core of the training of a clinical phenomenologist is learning how to recognize a given life world inhabited by a given patient. So there are two columns for this temple, which is the temple of clinical phenomenology. One is to have in mind a list of life worlds, okay, as they have been defined in our tradition. The second column is to have a method to explore the life world of patients, okay? This is the basic idea. So why is it so important to grasp the life world inhabited by a given patient? Well, because for a clinical phenomenologist, what is basic is to understand the way of being in the world of a patient. And to understand the way of being in the world of a patient means to understand the way he experiences the world and the way he behaves in the world. But in order to understand a certain kind of perception or action of a patient, we have to place this perception and action in his or her life world. We cannot understand someone's experiences or someone's action from a third-person perspective. We need a method that allows us to sit next to the patient and do our best to see the world with his or her eyes. That's the point. And for a clinical phenomenologist, understanding is the basic prerequisite for care, for therapeutic care. All right? Does it make sense to you?
Yes.
Is it clear? Is it clear enough? Okay, but I'm quite sure that you are familiar with these ideas. So, what did we do? Well, I could describe in a few minutes what we have done in our tradition in the last century, okay? We started with the works of Binswanger, Strauss, and Minkowski. Perhaps we can also put von Gebsattel next to them, with a description of the life world of people with schizophrenia, melancholia, mania, and obsession, especially contamination obsession, right? This was the first generation of clinical psychologists, including anthropanalysis, a phenomenological psychopathology. It had anthropological psychiatry, it had many different names, but the core business has been to describe the life world of people affected by severe, very severe psychopathological conditions: schizophrenia, melancholia, mania, and contamination obsession. Then we had a second generation of scholars, just to mention two of them, Hubertus Stellenbach and Wolfgang Blankenburg, who refined some descriptions about the life world, Stellenbach of people with melancholia and of typus melancholicus, melancholic type of personality. And Blankenburg did a great job in describing a certain form of schizophrenia, which I'm sure you are familiar with, non-delusional schizophrenia. But the purpose is the same, to describe the life world of people affected by severe mental disorders. So until the 80s or 90s, there has been, of the last century, there's been very little work on other forms of mental disorders. For instance, very little work on hysteria, no work on so-called borderline personality disorder, hardly any work in addictions, right? No work at all on anorexia nervosa, with the exclusion of Ellen West by Binswanger. But Binswanger unfortunately made a mistake because he mistakenly diagnosed Ellen West as a schizophrenic person and not as an anorexic person, but doesn't matter, okay? He's still the boss anyway. But there was hardly any work on narcissism, for instance, all right? Very little work on phobias. There's been some Italian phenomenologists who did some excellent work on phobia, like Calvi and Carniello, for instance, but they were not known outside Italy. Fortunately, at a certain moment, our colleagues, the third generation of clinical phenomenologists, realized that we needed to describe the life world structures also of these people. And then it popped out the work of Georges Charbonneau on hysteria, which is an excellent work. Popped up the work of Guilherme Messas and Gilberto Di Petta on addictions, just to mention a couple of examples. Some preliminary work by Otto Doerzegers in Chile about bulimia nervosa. All right. And then some of my work on eating disorders, on borderline, so I call it homodissipans because I don't like the word borderline. Some work on narcissism, I call it homo economicus. Why that? Well, why my generation of clinical phenomenologists was interested in other forms of mental disorders? Well, the answer is very easy because apparently the old forms, including schizophrenia, melancholia, sensu-Tellenbach, well, they were not so common anymore as they used to be in the first half of the last century. Well, till the 60s or the 70s, perhaps. Okay. I'm sure that a great majority of patients seen by Hubertus Stellenbach in Heidelberg Clinic, Heidelberg Psychiatric Clinic, patients who were hospitalized there, affected by depression, they were affected by melancholia, so melancholic depression, all right? But now we nowadays see many other forms, perhaps not many other forms, but other forms of depression, which is not the melancholic type of depression described by Tellenbach, a depression with ideas of guilt, strong motor retardation, and the feeling of the loss of feeling. We see other forms of depressions, all right? We see dysphoric depressions, for instance, etc. And we also see other forms of illnesses which were hardly known to our ancestors, eating disorders, for instance. Also borderline personality disorder, you know that this diagnosis came up from studies, psychoanalytic studies in the US in the 60s or late 50s. But we, as clinicians, psychiatria pratica, now I think that perhaps the majority of people, the majority of patients we see are not affected by schizophrenia in a traditional sense. They are not affected by melancholia in a traditional sense, all right? So we did a great job, I must say, in describing other forms of psychopathological conditions. Okay. In structural terms. Why? Because we could see that in borderline personality disorder, there is a structure. We could see that in addiction, there is a structure. We could see that in hysteria, there is a structure. We could see that the way of being in the world of, let's make the example of people with borderline, so-called borderline personality disorder, is characterized by a specific way of experiencing time, specific character of lived time, a specific character of lived body, a specific way of experiencing other people and of experiencing space. And that these dimensions of their life world, they were structurally connected to each other. Okay, I will not go into details about the structure, the structure of the life world of these people, because I would like to talk about episodic people, which probably do not have a structure as we understood it in the last century. But let's go step by step. Okay. We have done quite a big job. I say we, who are these we? Louis Sass has done a great job with schizophrenia. Joseph Parnas has done a great job with schizophrenia. I already mentioned Guilherme Messas and Gilberto Di Petta. Here in Italy, I would say that Mario Rossimonti has done quite a good job in characterizing borderline condition, for instance. To the point that, as you may know, in 2018, I was able to publish the Oxford Handbook of Phenomenological Psychopathology. That wouldn't be possible if all these colleagues and friends wouldn't have done a great job in reconstruction the structures of the life world of the basic forms of miscarried existence, including those I've mentioned until now, okay? And I myself, I've published this small book, The Therapeutic Interview in Mental Health, which in Italian is Mondi Psicopatologici, Psychopathological Worlds, a book I would like to have translated into Portuguese, by the way, which is indeed a handbook of clinical phenomenology, containing succinct, I mean, quite descriptions, although schematic descriptions of the basic life worlds that we encounter in psychiatria pratica in the clinic. All right? Is that clear until now?
Perfectly.
Okay, good. But now we are at a turn. Something is happening, and we, clinicians working in the front line as psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, psychotherapists, we see that something is changing in the clinic. We see that not all our patients fit in the structures we have described until now. That's the point. So, in former times, we realized that patients do not fill in diagnostic categories. And we devised structural psychopathology. Now we see that our structural psychopathology is not enough to understand other forms of existence that we see in the clinic, which are becoming more and more frequent. And so we need to approach these patients not with a structural mind frame, but with what I call the phenomenology of the fragment. What do I mean by that? Okay. Let's see that, first of all, we have to figure out that this metamorphosis of the clinic, metamorphosis of psychopathological forms, goes hand in hand with a metamorphosis in our culture, in our society. At the change from the 20th and the 21st century, we have assisted to profound changes in our culture and in our society. We are very well aware of them. The first one, which started in the post-Second World War, has been named the Society of the Spectacle. It was described in the early 60s already by people like Guy Debord, for instance, in France. But you can find very interesting ideas already in Jean-Paul Sartre, and later in Michel Foucault. Okay. The Society of the Spectacle is the society which puts at its center visibility, image, what can be seen from the outside. Image is what is deemed more important in the Society of the Spectacle. Okay. This has been a great change in the second part of the last century. And perhaps this change, this cultural change, was reflected in the epidemics of certain psychopathological forms, including anorexia. In a book of mine entitled Selfie, that I published in Italian almost 10 years ago now, what I try to describe is the strong connection between the culture of the selfie and the culture of anorexia. Because for both of them, at the center of their life world, there is the image. So people with anorexia, they need to feel seen by the others in order to feel their own body. All right. And perhaps some changes also in other psychopathological forms, which I call the homofigurans, including hysteria, has been the consequence, or perhaps not the consequence, but goes hand in hand with the society of the spectacle, with the society of the image. Okay. But we also know, and this is our time, that we live in the information age. We live in the culture of information. Okay. Just to quote a short book, but very interesting book about the digital culture. I would advise you to read Byung-Chul Han's book about that. Byung-Chul Han is a philosopher who is also a star in the philosophical system. So he may have written perhaps too much, but some of his books are really extremely important for the education of young psychiatrists and clinical psychologists. Okay. So we live in the age of information. What is the age of information? We know this very well. It doesn't only bring advantages like being able to talk through the ocean as we are doing right now, but it also brings, this is a radical change in our culture, of course. I mean, we can be in touch virtually instead of physically. So this is certainly a great change in the way we live our own self. Okay. It is a change in terms of disembodiment of presence. All right. But it's not only that. There is also another very big change, which I would like to underscore now, and it is the following. As with the society of the spectacle, there is an accumulation of images. With the society of the spectacle, there is an accumulation of images. With the society of information, there is an accumulation of data. Accumulation of data. And when I say accumulation, I mean really accumulation. What does it mean, accumulation? That these data are available for us in a non-structural aggregation. So I can access data as isolated data, so as data which are not aggregated in a structure or in a narrative. That's the point. So we are getting, which book by Byung-Chul Han? I will tell you later. I will tell you later. I will check this up and I will tell you later. So please, it's good that you pin down your questions. There will be enough time to discuss all these issues if you want. So accumulation of data means that data are available for us, but especially for young generation, okay, for millennials, our new patients, not as aggregated data in structural narratives, but as isolated data. For instance, Byung-Chul Han argues that this brings about a crisis of narrativity. This brings about a decline of storytelling. This brings about our capacity to bring together these data and aggregate them in a diachronic sequence, in a narrative, in a story, okay? And this is a very important metamorphosis, because if the new generation becomes acquainted with getting in touch with the data as discrete data instead of aggregate data, this will probably affect the way we think. This will probably bring about a fragmentation of the way we experience the world. I am a boomer, and I belong to the generation to which narrativity has been a must, you know, including in the clinic. In the clinic, we have been taught that the way out from a given psychopathological form was to establish a coherent narrative, that psychotherapy was narrativity. Okay? I could give you several examples, but the narrative trend in psychiatry, in psychology, and also in medicine has been paramount in the last 20, 30 years. Narrative medicine. What is narrative medicine? Narrative medicine has been a great revolution, a positive revolution. And what was the basic tenet? What is the basic tenet of narrative medicine? That we must help our patients to bring together the pieces of their experience and help them to bring a narrative of their illness, of their cancer, okay, of their diabetes, and of course, of their mental disorder. So my generation, perhaps not yours, I don't know, we can discuss this, but my generation of clinicians has been brought up with the idea that the narrative function was fundamental for therapeutic care. So that the task of the clinician was centered on helping the patient to develop his narrative function, his narrative capacity. So his capacity for aggregating experiences into a coherent, diachronic, chronological narrative. Okay? Does it make sense to you? And I believe this is true. I still believe this is true. I still believe this is true. I still believe that it is important for clinicians to look for a structure. It is important for clinicians to help patients to develop a coherent narrative of their condition. It is. But here is the but. My clinical experience, especially with young people, adolescents, especially the post-COVID generation, is that these people bring me disaggregate fragments rather than diachronical narratives. And of course, you could say, well, of course, they are sick. So, of course, they are not able to aggregate these fragments. Yeah, but this is not the point. The real point is that as philosophers have already intuited, next to diachronic human type, we see the rise of an episodic human type. We see the rise of a human type who experiences the world fragmentarily. Well, I don't want to talk about politics in these very dark times, but if you see what's going on in the last few weeks in the international geopolitical scenario, you have perhaps an outstanding exemplar of episodic human type embodied by Donald Trump. In the 2020, American psychologist wrote an essay about episodic Trump. So it was before he became president of the United States for the second time. Okay, I can send you the paper. This guy, this colleague, wrote a book about that, and then he wrote a very nice paper. He is an expert in narrative psychology, so he knows, and in narrative identity, he knows what he's talking about. And what he says, I will read you what he says. Exactly. Okay. I don't want to put it on politics, but just take this description as an example of an episodic man. Okay. People make meaning through life narrative. The central thesis of my book-length psychological biography of Donald Trump is that the President of the United States defied this general meaning-making tendency and epitomized instead the episodic man. Like no other president in modern history, Trump seems to be nearly devoid of a narrative identity, which is an internalized and evolving story of the self that reconstructs the personal past and imagines the future in order to provide life with temporal continuity and meaning. Instead, Trump has always lived in the emotionally vivid moment episode, fighting to win each moment, moment by discrete moment. Seeing him through the lens of the episodic man helps to explain many puzzling features of Donald Trump's personality, from his charismatic effect on millions of Americans to his penchant for lying and malice. Absit injuria verbis, we would say in Latin. I don't want to blame Trump. I mean, I'm just a psychopathologist. Of course, I'm a citizen of the world, but even if these lines were not about Donald Trump, and I think that the colleague is quite right, but I mean, the name of the colleague is Dan McAdams, whom may know. This is a perfect description of a new type of human being who lives his existence or her existence moment by moment, okay? And has no interest in bringing together the present with the past and with the future. Not that it has no capacity. To have no capacity is one thing. To have no interest is another thing. I don't know if Trump or Trump-like human beings have no capacity. I'm quite sure that they have no interest. Okay? So the point is, if we put to use our narrative mind frame to help these people, would we be helpful for them? That's my question. And this is the question of a clinician. I mean, how can I help my patients? If I have in mind that to spend a good life means being able to develop a narrative identity in order to provide life with temporal continuity and meaning, and my patient is not interested in that, that cannot be the way I can help my patient. Okay. Now we know that at least we are at least aware of some old psychopathological types who seem to be in troubles with narrative identity. The borderline is in trouble with having a narrative identity. People with addictions, they have troubles with establishing a narrative identity. There are other human types who have a very strong, rigid, ossified, crystallized narrative identity. Think of people with paranoia, for instance, or neurotic people. Neurotic people, they have an ossified, although conflictual, narrative identity. But my feeling is that we will see another kind of episodic psychopathology as compared to the past. And we need to be ready for that. That's my feeling. Adolescents, we just published a paper with a student of mine who graduated some years ago at our school here in Florence of phenomenological dynamic psychotherapy. You may know that we started a postgraduate school in phenomenological dynamic psychotherapy here in Florence, and we are very happy with it. This student of ours who is working with adolescents in Switzerland, he did a very good job in describing some case studies of adolescents who do not have a structure, but they are affected by severe kinds of mental disorder in which we could trace some elements proper to the structure of schizophrenia, namely loss of common sense, okay? But these patients, they don't live in a schizophrenic world because they do not structure a schizophrenic world. So there is a fragment of schizophrenia in their life. But from this fragment doesn't develop a schizophrenic structure. So this is something that we found extremely helpful in figuring out how to help these people who display fragments rather than a structure. Do you see what I mean until now? Can you follow my reasoning until now? Or would you like to ask me some questions before I go to some suggestions, some final suggestions before discussion?
I guess we are following your thoughts.
Good. Okay. Raffaella says, Felipe says it's okay. So, very good. Now, I don't want to say that you as young clinicians will not see patients who live in a structured life world. Of course, you will see many patients like this. And I hope that what we have done until now in describing these structures will be of help for you to understand the kind of being in the world of these patients. All right. But what I argue is that next to this capacity for a phenomenology of the structure, you need to develop a phenomenological capacity of the fragment, a capacity for a phenomenology of the fragment. Because what I argue is that you will see more and more patients who display fragments of what we might have called before a structure, but it is not a structure. For instance, we know that loss of common sense is a piece of a schizophrenic structure, right? We owe this to Blankenburg. Before him, there's been some work by Minkowski about that. I did some work on that in a book that is called Disembodied Spirits and the Animated Body, The Psychopathology of Common Sense. So for instance, when I wrote that book about 20 years ago, well, I thought that every time I saw a patient with a disorder of common sense, that patient had to be schizophrenic. This is what I had in mind. I thought that I had discovered the core of schizophrenia as a condition characterized by the loss of common sense. So loss of common sense meant the core of schizophrenia. Now, what I see in the clinic is that there are patients who are characterized by loss of common sense, but they do not display other features, other phenomena of schizophrenia. That's the point. That's the basic. So, what do I suggest? I suggest that we hold on very tightly with our knowledge about structures, there's no doubt, that we hold on very tightly with our knowledge about the pieces of these structures, like loss of common sense, but also suggest that we must be free to grasp these fragments out of a structure. That's my point. And the suggestion is also that we should be aware that therapeutic care cannot just be helping patients to bring together these fragments into a structure or into a narrative, because they may not be able or they may not be interested. So we need to be able to work with these fragments. And this is very difficult because you know that a fragment is cutting. Okay? It's hard to grasp. You see, we don't even, at least in Italian, I don't know in Portuguese, we don't even have a word to speak of a fragment which is not a fragment of a whole. We don't have a word to say that this piece is not the piece of a whole, as if our mind would only conceive of a fragment as the outcome of a fragmentation instead of as a primary datum of experience. This is something philosophical very interesting, not philosophical in sense of abstractly. It's very important that we don't have in Italian, in English, I don't know, in Portuguese, a word to say that this thing isolated is not isolated because before it belonged to a structure and something broke down the structure and the outcome was this isolated piece. But we have to learn to think that this isolated piece perhaps are there before the existence of a structure. This is my suggestion. Okay, now, with all that in place, we need to make a step further. Especially we who have a responsibility for the training of young clinicians. Because young clinicians, we know very well, they need, as I was saying in the beginning, at least two things: a method, but also a map. So we had the old map of the life wells. Now we need a map of the fragments. This is the work of the next couple of decades in clinical phenomenology for me. To try to build a map of the fragments, or as I may call them, of the knots, of the nodes, of the existential knots that are expressed fragmentarily in some kinds of existence. This work has some predecessors. For instance, Carl Jaspers, in the Psychology of Worldviews. I don't know if you are familiar with this book. It is a book written by Carl Jaspers in 1919. You remember that he wrote the General Psychopathology in 1913, the first edition. And then his second book has been the Psychologie des Weltanschauungen, the Psychology of Worldviews, which is a very interesting book in phenomenological psychology before he turns to philosophy, okay? There, he speaks of limit situations, Grenzsituationen, limit situation, like guilt, death are limit situations, okay? Well, limit situations are indeed existential notes, in some sense. The problem of guilt, the problem of death, the problem of the reality of reality, the problem of common sense, the problem of justice, the problem of truth, the problem of love. These are all human existential notes, which are, of course, under-researched in mainstream psychiatrists and clinical psychologists. But this is my intention for the future, and I'm glad to have on board people who would like to collaborate on this project. That's also the reason why I have chosen to give this talk to you. If we bring together our competence and experience, clinical experience, perhaps we can establish a map of these existential notes. And this would help recognize some of these notes in the fragments presented by our patients. Forgetting about nosographical diagnosis, and perhaps also bracketing, making the epoche of psychopathological worlds, life worlds. So this is my general hypothesis. This is my suggestion. Just in form of tentative conclusion. What is going to be our work with our patients if this is the case? Well, rather than trying to recognize a life world, we will learn how to recognize an existential knot in a fragment. Rather than trying to reconstruct a narrative starting from these existential knots, we will do another kind of operation, which is sort of montage of these knots. I've written a paper in which I was inspired by post-production in contemporary art. So our work will be a work similar to the work of post-production. What is post-production? Is picking up disparate materials and bringing them together in a form which is not the original form from which the fragments come from, but it is a new form inside which each fragment may get a new meaning for the patient. Like in a movie montage, like in the works of two non-phenomenologists of the 20th century, which are inspiring very much my work, Walter Benjamin and Abi Warburg, who discovered new ways into history of culture, Walter Benjamin, and history of art, Abi Warburg. By the way, Abi Warburg has been a patient of Binswanger in the Bellevue Clinic. He stayed with Binswanger for a few years, as affected by a severe form, perhaps, of a severe form of delusional mania or schizoaffective disorder, as it might have been diagnosed. So, of course, I'm not able to anticipate the future, but if I see the next generation of clinical phenomenology at work, I will see them at work as expert of post-production, of bringing together fragments, not with the purpose of reconstructing a structure which is not there, or narrating something that makes sense chronologically, but with the purpose of illuminating each fragment with another fragment via the light that each fragment can shed on the other fragment for the purpose of extracting new meanings for the patient, of course, from each structure of his own experience. And if you're happy with that, I would stop here, thanking you very much for your attention and waiting for your remarks and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Stanghellini. I myself have some questions, but I will give place to the students. But I will bring a short comment on that because it's really interesting to see. It's almost like a shift on the paradigm. Because when we are studying like phenomenological psychopathology, it's a very common question that raised in our students, like it really comes like that. Where is the melancholia that we study? Because in the clinics, the depression are really different from that. So in your lesson, it kind answered a little bit of that. And if any student have a question now, feel free to ask, because I guess it will brings a interesting debate on that.
Okay. Shall I wait before I try to reply to your question, perhaps? Or
Feel free to uh, feel free anything you like, but
okay. So look, first thing I will do, I will attach a paper, a very short paper that I have written and may be of help to answer your question. 2023, here it is. It's published in European Psychiatry. So this is a paper about the heterogeneity of depressions. All right. And I try to pinpoint, maybe I could try to project, there is a figure, but anyway, I try to pinpoint 4 kinds of depression. Each one characteristic of a vulnerable structure. Well, this is it's not so easy to summarize, but can I take 5 minutes for explaining you how I teach my students to conduct a therapeutic interview? Okay, very shortly, very shortly. Say that you have in front of you a patient who displays depressive symptoms or depressive phenomena. Okay. You must be able to do 3 things. First, to assess the kind of depression he's affected by. There are depressions characterized by guilt, by themes of ruin, illness, okay? There are other kinds of depression characterized by other kinds of feelings, like feelings of emptiness, other kinds of depression which are characterized by ideas of bankruptcy, and others by frustration, demoralization. These are different types of depression. Then you must be able to assess the vulnerable structure of the person. So what was the lifestyle of this person before he fell into depression? For instance, Tellenbach described the lifestyle of the typus melancholicus. What is the typus melancholicus? It's not a kind of depression. No. The typus melancholicus is a kind of personality. I don't like the term personality, to be honest, but it is an anthropological makeup, vulnerable. Vulnerable. He describes the characteristics of this typus melancholicus: conscientiousness, orderliness, and then heteronomia, intolerance of ambiguity. These are not symptoms of major depression. These are traits of this kind of personality. So you must be able to assess the kind of depression, but also the kind of personality. Two things. Third thing, you must be able to assess the limit situation. So how this person decompensates. So you must be able to do three things: recognize the phenomena in the acute decompensation phase, be able to recognize the traits that existed before the decompensation phase, and the limit situation through which the person entered into the acute phase of depression. All right? And you will see that in this way, you will figure out that there are different kinds of depressions. For instance, the depression of the melancholic type of personality is characterized by guilt, ruin, illness, all themes of loss. But the depression of a borderline person, which I call homo dissipans, is not characterized by guilt, it's characterized by feeling of emptiness. The depression of the narcissistic kind of personality, which I call homo economicus, is characterized by themes of bankruptcy and the impossibility of power and success, which is totally extraneous to melancholic depression. And the depressive decompensation of a neurotic person is characterized by frustration, demoralization. So there are different kinds of depressive decompensation, and hypothetically, each of these kind of depressive decompensation are linked to a vulnerable structure, to a different lifestyle which is vulnerable. For instance, the homo dissipans is characterized by the values of excess, the value of intensity, the value of expenditure. What is expenditure? It is the need to evacuate an excess of energies, of unformed and unstructured energies. The Homo economicus is characterized by other values. He values performance, utility, optimization of resources, of time, nothing to do with the typus melancholicus or Homo dissipans. The Homo nevroticus, he values the impossibility. He values prohibition. Oh, I wish I could, but I can't because this is not possible. This completely another kind of pre-depressive personality, you see. So there is some empirical work to be done on that to validate this classification. Let's call it classification. I don't like it, but anyway. But I hope this may help to answer your question.
Thank you very much.
All right. There is Rodrigo Silveira. The phenomenological, may I read it?
Yes, please, Professor.
The phenomenon, well, by the way, Professor, we are colleagues, aren't we? So my name is Giovanni.
Okay.
Okay, good. Which is for everybody in this room. Okay, good. The phenomenological approach, if I understood it correctly, is a way to better diagnose and follow the prognosis. Do you believe it could help non-biological therapy, like psychotherapy? These are two questions, Rodrigo. So, first question, the phenomenological approach is a way to better diagnose and follow the prognosis. Well, to better diagnose. I suggest that we don't use the word diagnosis and to diagnose in phenomenology. I prefer the word recognition, which is ethically more powerful. My purpose as a clinical phenomenology is not to make a diagnosis. So to attribute a certain person to a nosographical category. No, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested much more in recognizing his way of being in the world, his form of existence. What does it mean to recognize? Recognize is a very strong word in phenomenology. If you read the essay by Paul Ricoeur on recognition, which he published in the last years of his life, you see how important is recognition ethically. I recognize someone else's, the legitimacy of someone else's way of being in the world. So, as a clinical phenomenologist, I recognize the legitimacy of the schizophrenic way of being in the world. I recognize the legitimacy of the anorexic way of being in the world. So the other person needs to feel recognized by me. Recognize means that he feels that I acknowledge that his way of being in the world has value. This is not diagnosis. Diagnosis is another thing. Diagnosis is picking up symptoms to individuate a kind of illness in a given person and then put this person into the box of the nosographical categories. But in this way, the person doesn't feel recognized. He feels stigmatized. Diagnosis goes with stigma. not with recognition, exactly the opposite, you see. So let's call it recognition, phenomenological recognition. I recognize that this person lives in a schizophrenic world. This helps me to approach him, to approximate him, to dialogue with him. Diagnosis is not that. That's one point. But of course, we should talk a lot about this issue because this is a core issue of the whole therapeutic process, of the whole psychotherapeutic process, Rodrigo. Okay? Prognosis. Prognosis is another word that we as medical students have learned in our years of medicine, right? What is prognosis? It is knowing how it goes in advance, how it will end up. This is prognosis, okay? And this is extremely important, of course, in medicine. And this is also the basic idea guiding Emil Kraepelin when he started the classification of mental disorders. Remember, dementia precox is different from manic depressive disorder because of their symptoms, but also because their prognosis is different. Dementia precox ends up with dementia. Manic depressive disorder doesn't. So, prognosis is extremely important in biomedical model in psychiatry. Okay. But I think that prognosis is also the root of self-fulfilling prophecies. How can I know the destiny of a patient? I do my best to do something in order to change the prognosis of his illness. I use all my capacities to pick up the kairos, the right moment, to do certain things that may change the destiny of this patient. So, again, words like diagnosis and prognosis should be used very carefully from a phenomenological stance. Okay? And of course, this helps non-biological therapy. But not because I'm against biological therapies, of course. I mean, that would be simply crazy. And for the moment, I have some personality disorder, but not totally crazy, okay? Non-biological therapy which means, I think, in Rodrigo's words, psychotherapy, to me is based on understanding, recognition, kairos, and this sort of mindset to be used. Okay, then Isabella, thank you, Isabella. Which methodological and scientific ways do you think we can use to approach and research these existential knots and fragments? I tell you what we are doing here. I started a research with some of my students. We are interviewing persons who have some existential problems, and we are also interviewing clinicians with a qualitative method. I make the example of the interviewing clinicians. Okay, we ask clinicians, but are you happy with contemporary nosography? And of course, they will say no. So, which kind of nosography do you use? And someone would say psychodynamic nosography, PDM. Someone else would say constructivist, post-rationalist nosography. Okay, and some would say, I don't know. And then we ask, but then how do you orientate yourself in clinical navigation, so to say? And we try to pick up something from their experience. For instance, someone would say, well, for me, it's very important the emotions of the patient. And then we ask, which emotions do you value most important? And some would say, well, dysphoria. Let's say dysphoria. Oh, and what is dysphoria for you? Dysphoria is a state of irritability, etc. And why do you value that dysphoria is so important? Well, because I think that dysphoria, a clinician might answer, dysphoria is something that is part of the basic restlessness of human existence. And if someone is so dysphoric and restless, means that he has not been able to channel his moods in the right way. So, but the way is very long, Isabella, and everybody who has ideas is welcome. Victor Hugo, it seems to me that may I go on with reading the questions, or would you like to do it yourself?
It's I guess it's okay.
Okay. Seems to me that the idea that the being in its personality would have a phenomenology in its state of potency, and another phenomenology at the opposite pole in its state of impotence, depression, but still within the same dynamics of values. Is that it? The same dynamics of value. Yes, this is a very good point, Victor Hugo. Thank you very much. For instance, take the melancholic type of personality. The melancholic type of personality described by Tellenbach is totally engaged in avoiding guilt. But then when he falls ill, he is totally submerged by guilt. So this is quite a good point. Okay, so he spends all his life in actively avoiding guilt, but then when he falls into depression, he falls into a kind of impotence with respect to avoiding guilt. This is a very good point. Very good point. Activity versus passivity. Then Rodrigo, he mentions Fritz Perls and Carl Rogers. Yes, of course there are connections. But may I be a bit rude, perhaps? We have a method. We have a method. We have a method that we can teach you. A method of the therapeutic interview. And I'm very proud of that. Okay. For finish, do you believe that phenomenology can somehow influence current classification systems, or should it remain as a parallel way of understanding? Very good question, Joao. Well, I think we can do both. I think we can do both. I myself, I like very much to discuss with people um, who have ideas different from mine. And I like very much publishing my papers in journals which are not phenomenological. And for publishing in journals which are not phenomenological, like World Psychiatry, European Psychiatry, Comprehensive Psychiatry, Schizophrenia Bulletin, what else? Lancet Psychiatry, etc., which is a great satisfaction, narcissistically speaking. Well, to publish in these journals, of course, you need to compromise with their language. But this is very helpful. This is very helpful because it makes me clear that that language is not enough. But on the other hand, I can tell you, I try to develop a parallel system. In former times, it was the system of the life wells, and now it's the system of the fragments or the existential knots. I think you got it very well.
So thank you very much. It was really interesting to speak, and feel free to anytime you want to join us once again. It was a really pleasure to have you here.
Well, it's my pleasure. And of course, I cannot join you if you don't invite me, but feel free to invite me, okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
One thing I would like to do is to send you the reference for Byung-Chul Han,
Okay.
or we say goodbye to each other. Here it is, I guess. Oh.
Rafaela, thank you, Professor Giovanni. Definitely opening my mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And let's keep in touch.
Okay. We look forward to if it is as you have said in the beginning of your talk about the course here in Brazil. We would be very interested. I think it's a great opportunity to learn and to engage in this type of ideas.
I will let you know, or Guilherme will let you know
Hmm?
about that if there is some news about it. Here is the quote from Byung-Chul Han. Okay, so have a nice weekend
You
and
too.
enjoy your life.
Thank
Yeah,
you very much.
technology is growing a lot in Brazil. We see this in residence. Students are increasingly interested.
Very good. Very good. Very good.
Okay,
I'm sure that we are going to make a strong cooperation. And please let me know if you would like me to give some more lessons, and just give me a couple of months for organizing me, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
We
Thank
appreciate
you
that.
very much for the excellent class and for accepting our invitation. I would also like to thank the 50 students who joined us today. I hope that we can establish new partnerships in the future, Professor. That is
Great.
until next time. Bye.
Ciao. Ciao.
Tchau, tchau.
Ciao.